Good evening, everyone, and it's interesting times we're living in right now, and a lot of people are looking for what the solution is, but we all know what the solution is to the problems, and one of the big problems we're facing is the problem of racism, and I don't think that racism is really a true thing. There aren't any races. There's the one race, the human race, but there are different groups and ethnicities, and there's problems with being overgeneralizing with these groups and judging them by the color of the skin and not the content of their character. But there's also problems with the group's culture, but we don't ever talk about that either. And so I'm going to make the case for what I believe the solution is, what we have in the scripture. And the title is An Investigation into what the Bible, Science, and History says about racism. And the first point I want to make is the devil wants you to pay attention to your feelings. Jesus wants you to pay attention to his truth. We want to look at the facts. We want to look for justice. We don't want to go on the basis of feelings, but that's the way the world is. They go on the basis of feelings and not facts, and that just doesn't work out well. And we have to remember, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world's forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Ephesians 6:12. So it's not against flesh and blood. It's people that have been taken captive with bad ideas. And we try to change them individually so they have good ideas and do it in the culture, so that in our culture we can pick the leaders, and we want people who have a biblical worldview leading us, because the book of Proverbs says when the righteous are in power, the people rejoice. When the evil are in power, the people mourn. And important point in a battle is, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you will not fear the results of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. And that's Sun Tzu. And that's talking about war and real war, physical war, but I think it's more true in the spiritual warfare. And we got to understand what they're all about and what their thinking is and what their plans are. But Jesus warned us. He said, behold, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be you therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves. So we're not going in there to punch it out with people. We're to go in there with a good strategy like a serpent. And the craftiest of all beings is the serpent. And we are to have crafty thinking in dealing with the enemy, but be harmless as doves. I want to start with Henry Morris, and he's one of the great men in history, I believe. God puts certain people at certain places at certain times with amazing talents, and he was one of them. And he wrote the book, The Genesis Flood, and he faced a lot of criticism for him, but he put out the truth, and that's what God put him there for, and that's what God has put us there for. And so this quote from him is the truth, I believe. And he says, evolution is the root of atheism, of communism, Nazism, behaviorism, racism, economic imperialism, militarism, libertarianism, archaism, and all manners of anti-Christian beliefs and practices. All those beliefs up there are anti-Christian, anti-Christ, and all ideas are validated by the pseudoscience of evolution. And Jesus said, you'll know them by their fruit. And if evolution's a bad idea, we see their fruit is bad, so we know it's a bad idea. The important thing is we got to remember there's only one race, the human race. And this idea of races isn't a good idea. We all come together as one. And Jesus talked about that, and he answered and said unto them, have you not read that he made them at the beginning, made them male and female? And he said, for this cause shall a man leave father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. He's quoting the Old Testament there. The idea came that we came from two parents not so very long ago, Adam and Eve. And he designed marriage, and it started then, and that's what it's to be, between a male and a female. And some say, can you be married to people of different color? The Bible doesn't say that. It says you're not to be unequally yoked with unbelievers, for what fellowship has righteous with unrighteousness? The idea of skin color being an issue is not. It's what's in the inside. And when God was looking at David and his brothers, he was looking on the inside. He wasn't looking on the outside. And that's the way we should look at people, look on the inside. Another important verse in this battle is Acts 17:26, and has made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on the face of the earth, and has determined the times before appointment. So he put us here at a certain time. He put Dr. Morris here at a certain time, and he did it as all part of his plan. But you got to remember, we're all one blood. Our blood only works with humans, and anybody who's type A positive can take my blood. And we can't take monkey's blood. And it's just humans that have this blood, and we didn't evolve from anything else. One blood. Adam and Eve in 1 Corinthians 15:45 and Genesis 3:20 came sons and daughters, Genesis 5:4, and came down to Noah and his son, kind of a bottleneck, Genesis 9:17 and 19. In the Tower of Babel, different groups were divided, people groups and cultures and languages, actually, at the Tower of Babel. And the Bible says in Genesis 1, it mentions kinds, different kinds, everyone according to their own kind. And that's what we believe happened, that there was the first of a kind, the cat kind, the dog kind, the bear kind, the mongoose kind, all the different kinds had information for all the subspecies. Basically, the kind is close to being the family in the science, what they called in the science world today. And so the dog, the original dogs, they say, were wolf-like, and they had all the genetic information for the Pekingese and the Great Dane, and short hair and long hair. And the bears had different kind for dark skin and light skin, and the light skins did better in the snowy areas. And it was all part of God's plan, and so there could be diversity, so they could move out among the whole earth. And this has been verified recently by science. And sweeping gene survey reveals new facets of evolution. This should have been on the front page of every newspaper and magazine and every evening news, but I found it in phys.org. That's the only one it had. But here's a quote: for the planet's 7.6 billion people, 500 million house sparrows, and 100,000 sandpipers, genetic diversity is about the same. Mark Schockel of the Rockefeller University in New York told AFP. The study seemed to subvert evolutionary theory in two respects. First, it showed a clear delineation between species, and second, it has almost all species being created at the same time. Why didn't they come out with a headline saying Bible has been verified? And but they didn't come out with that, and it's perfectly aligned with what the Bible says with the different kinds. And this is the link, I got it on phys.org. And another quote from the scientists: race is an unscientific concept. We truly are all kin beneath the skin. Many scientists are concluding. The more closely research examines the human genome, the complete of genetic material encased in the heart of almost every cell in the body, the more most of them are convinced that the standard labels used to distinguish people by race has little or no biological meaning. It just isn't a good scientific conclusion, is what he's saying. And we found that recently from mapping the genome. They say while it may seem easy to tell at a glance whether a person is Caucasian, African, or Asian, the ease dissolves when one probes beneath the surface characteristics and scans the genome for DNA hallmarks of race. As it turns out, scientists say the human species is so young on an evolutionary scale and its migratory pattern so wide, restless, and rococo that it has not had a chance to divide into separate biological groups or races in any but the most superficial ways. There's very little difference between all the people groups. They're saying we're all one blood. Race is a social concept, not a scientific one, says Dr. J. Craig. Human Genome Project said the biggest difference genetically between the most diverse races amounts to a trifling 0.012%. There's no big difference between different individuals, people. There might be 0.2%, but the difference between races is much less, 0.12%. Adam and Eve had all the genetic information for all the skin colors. They are our ancestors. And I believe that Adam and Eve were probably darker skinned. Some people don't like that, but that only makes sense because if they have all the genetic for darker skin and for lighter skin, they're going to be at least medium brown in color, in the skin color. And this is a simplification of the genetic variation where they had all capital A and little a and capital B and little b, and shows how when the genes are passed on to different ones, how you can have the different skin types. And actually there's no white and black, it's light tan and dark brown. And it all makes sense that they have the genetic information for all of them. This has been verified quite a few times recently, where this couple here were medium brown and they have two twins, and one was light skinned and one is dark skinned, because they both had the information for both. And that is an amazing thing that this came out, and that's what happened in how we got different races. And so the amount of melanin determines skin color. The amount of melanin is controlled by the number of melanin producing cells called melanocytes. Dark-skinned people have more, while light-skinned people have fewer. That's the difference. And it's interesting, the bad news for the light-skinned people is if we get out in the sun too much, we can get skin cancer rather easily, and also eye cancer. And that's why we have skin sunblock and these different things for light-skinned people. And for dark-skinned people, they can be in the sun a long time and they're not going to have complications like that. And it seems like it was designed by God by that. And another problem, though, is that the dark-skinned people require more sunlight to get enough vitamin D, which is very important to your immune system. And the light-skinned people can develop it faster, so they don't have to be in the sun as much to get vitamin D they need for their immune system. And so it has worked out well. Actually, with the COVID-19, they found countries with higher levels of vitamin D had fewer infections, and because they had stronger immune systems. So keeping vitamin D up is also very important, but it's all designed by God. And This is another quote from a mental health professional, and he's saying, hey, science has figured it out. Why haven't we figured it out? Originally based on a system of folk taxonomies, the term race has been used to group people by physical appearance, often with disruptive and harmful social consequences. Given that many national and international scientific groups have diminished their use of the term race in the classification of people, it is time for the mental health professionals to seriously discuss the role and assess the usefulness of the race term. I think it's mental health professionals. I think everybody in government and in business, in everywhere of life, they need to get rid of these race ideas. It's just harmful for everyone involved and has harmful social consequences. The icons of evolutionists aid to humans shows ancestral humanoids as dark skin colored. So interesting, they come up with the idea that dark skinned people are not as evolved as light skinned people. We have the idea that our ancestors were dark skinned. And so there's nothing wrong with dark skinned, and we're all have been through the same approximate number of generations as each other, so there's no problem with people's skin. But evolution teaches, and when they teach it to our kids, indoctrinate it to our kids, it naturally follows that you would be a racist and think that they were inferior. And that's just not part of it. So how did people get different colors around the world? It all started with the Tower of Babel. Nimrod tried to call them all together, and God stopped them because he knew he'd do evil things. And then God divided them up, and the Tower of Babel is right there in Iraq today. And I believe he sent different groups, gave them different languages, and he sent the lighter skins north, the medium skins east and west, and the darker skins to the south. Some people said, well, maybe the lighter skins survived and the darker skins when they went up north. I think God had it figured out before, had the lighter skins all come together and just had them go up there and start multiplying the way he wanted them to do. And the darker skinned went down there to places where there's a lot more sun, and they were suited for it, and it's all by design. And your skin colors from God, it's sacred, and it's part of your heritage, it's part of the history, it's part of the providence. And don't look down on people for their skin color. And the Bible says, this is a solution. It says, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. There is no greater command than these, Jesus said in Mark 12:31. And C.S. Lewis describes this love. Love is not an affectionate feeling, but a steady wish for the loved person's ultimate good as far as it can be obtained. It is seeking God's best for the other person. Jesus said, love our enemies. We got to seek the best for our enemies. Their best is that they have Jesus Christ as their Savior and that they have a biblical worldview. And that's what we are to work on in our relationship with the world. And Jesus Christ says, no greater love hath a man than this, than a man lay down his life for his friends. Jesus Christ gave that example. And he showed us that example, and because of that example, we are to show that kind of love to the world, that same love, because he loved us that much, and seeking God's best for them. And here's an important verse from Philippians 2:3-4. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourself. Each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. That's a very important book. And we got to look and think of others better than ourselves. Don't ever think of ourselves better than others. Think of others better than ourselves in humility. The alternative is doing it out of selfishness, ambition, or vain conceit. That's what the world does. That's what when Christians have children, we see them as a gift from God, and we're to teach them and to instruct them and show them how to live right in this lost and dying world. Atheists, some of them do the same thing, but they're do an illogical conclusion. The logical thing for an atheist to do is see what's in it for them. They have friends, but they only have friends with those people that have something they can offer them. We are friends with everyone who wants to be our friend, and we're to look out for the best interests of everyone else. And there's a problem with the world, and this is something the world doesn't talk about. And Deuteronomy chapter 28 and Leviticus chapter 26 talks about bad things happen when you follow God's plan, and when you go on the my way highway. Good things happen when you follow God's plan, which is Route 66, following the 66 books of the Bible. But when you get on the my way highway, bad things happen. And Leviticus 26 says this. It's summed up in Deuteronomy 11, 26, and 28. According to the Father blessed are those that obey his commandments, and cursed are those who disobey his commandments. So the problem with the world is not like, oh, people were not genetically evolved in Africa. No, they didn't get with God's plan as fast as some other groups did. And what we need to do is help them get with God's plan, and they'll get up to speed if they start living the Route 66 life. And also you have the divine institutions that they don't live by, and that we have to live by, that we want to encourage the world to live by if we want the world to have God's best. The first is free choice volition. God gave man volition, the right and ability to make choices, good and bad, free will. So the government should give free choice to all the individuals. That's the ideal government. Marriage was very important. God planned it from the beginning. God has planned that one man and one woman would join in a union. Marriage provides the authority and stability for morality and the family. Strong marriages make strong families, make strong communities make strong cities make strong states, and strong states make a strong union. A family is the first and most important classroom and training ground for society. The family provides the security, the heritage, the perpetuation of morality, without which no society can survive. Nationalism, God planned that people would live in groups called nations. This happened at the Tower of Babel. It was a checks and balance to a globalist evil idea. And he said that nations are to have language, borders, and culture. And so society thinks people are basically good. You don't have to train them. Why do you need families? And it just doesn't work out well. And a free society has to be a moral society. Otherwise, you're going to not have a free society. Another idea is very important. James Denny says the depravity which sin has produced in human nature extends to the whole of it. There is no part of man's nature which is unaffected by it. Man's nature is all a piece, and what affects it at all affects it all together. So we have this sin nature in us. We have this selfishness, this vain conceit, and you have to recognize it when you're setting up a government, when you're setting up an economic system. When you set up, the reason for you have families is to teach that we don't follow our sinful nature. Another important point, Jesus prayed for us in his prayer in John 17:23, and he said, I in them and you in me, may they be brought to complete unity, to let the world know that you sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me. The idea of unity and from diversity comes from the Bible. It's in the Old Testament, Psalm 133. Paul talks about it in Ephesians, and it's other places it's talked about. And Jesus said, this is our prayer for us. And it goes back to the ancient Greeks talking about that. They wanted to have unity and diversity, and Aristotle taught it to his number one student, Alexander the Greek, and he conquered the world so there could be unity and diversity. And it just didn't work out well, but he did Hellenize the world, and there was a kind of universal language that they could communicate the Word of God with. So it was a bad thing that God turned into a good thing, but this whole idea is university comes from unity and diversity, but philosophically, you can't have unity and diversity in the effect if you don't have unity and diversity in the cause. And Jesus and the Holy Spirit and the Father are the community of the Trinity, and there is unity and diversity. And in the countries of the world, if you watch the Olympics in the past, you see everybody from every country looks the same, but this, because we had a Christian dominant worldview in our country, we have people looking all different in the United States, and we have unity and diversity because we were a Christian nation, and we aren't going to have that unity and diversity as we move away from being a Christian nation. And Jesus, he mentioned that, knew their thoughts, and said to them, any kingdom divided against itself will be ruined, and a house divided against itself will fall. Well, he's talking about his miracles, but he brings up a universal truth. And this is a truth throughout history. And Satan doesn't want there to be strong nations following Christ, so he's going to try to divide us any way we can to neutralize us. Interesting quote from an unbeliever, Immanuel Kant, and the existence of the Bible as a book for the people is the greatest belief the human race has ever experienced. Every attempt to belittle it is a crime against humanity. He realized it. He's looked at history, looked at what's going on in the world, and he knew that that the Bible was the answer. But ironically, I was looking up the start of racism, and he was like, actually, I got that quote, but he was the important early figure in the history of racism. He sketched out a formal racial hierarchy, writing in his books on the different races of man, with that humanity exists in its greatest perfection in the white race. The yellow Indian has a smaller amount of talent. The Negroes are lower, and the lowest part of the American peoples, I guess the Native Americans. Supplied the first scientific definition of race. There was racism before actually the ancient Hindus thought the white people were further reincarnated and to a higher level of reincarnation, trying to get to nirvana, nothingness. Slavery in America, it wasn't the same as slavery in the Bible, I'll tell you. The Bible condemns man-stealing. And basically slavery in our country was man-stealing. They snatched people and used them for your own personal project. And there was some slavery. It was a form of employment. Sometimes a country would take over another country. They'd tax them or make them do public works and different things. And but man-stealing was wrong. The slavery we had in America was wrong. But let me tell you how it happened. The North was occupied by light-skinned people, and they were fleeing persecution because they were literalists, believers in the Bible literally. And they wanted a place where they could be free to have their own beliefs. And they were very anti-slavery in the North. And the people that were against them were the Church of England. And the Church of England, some of the poorer folks, came over and took some slaves that they had over there and started setting up in the South. And they tried tobacco and found out that cotton grew real well. And so they started getting more people, and they started getting slaves from Africa. And it's funny, Tocqueville, who wrote history, he talked about the North and South. He said the South is stagnant because they rejected God's idea. Nothing was going good there. They had their cotton, they had their slaves, but that's about all they had. He said the North, the difference in the North is those people are religious, but they not only are religious, they believe their religion. So that was the difference in the North. They believed it. In the South were marginal Christians, like the Church of England was. They were drunks, immoral, and Christians in name only, it would seem to me, but that's between them and the Lord. Another thing that they did in the South is they would, once a slave woman got pregnant, they would send off the father and trade him off with another slave owner. They didn't want the father in the picture. And then when the children were born, they were put into daycare as soon as possible, and it was all to get them dependent on the slave master. And the story of Harriet Tubman, she had a father who was free. And when she was a young girl, the master sent her two sisters away because he didn't want them to be by their father. But he forgot to send Harry away, and she became independent. She wasn't dependent on the slave owner, and then she went and became one of the biggest forces of freedom of slaves in the country. And her two sisters she found, and they really didn't want to leave that bad. She had to really convince them. So getting them dependent, and some of the slave owners decide, forget about the men, I'll just get the women pregnant myself. It'd be a lot easier. And so these people were sick. Lincoln, on the founding fathers, had opposed slavery. They adopted a Declaration of Independence that pronounced that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. They are given these rights at birth. And this was set up to do away with slavery. And here's a quote from George Washington. I wish from my soul that the legislature of this state could see a policy of gradual abolition of slavery. George Washington, he bought some slaves, but he let them work their way free. Also, John Jay said, it is much to be wished that slavery may be abolished. The honor of the states as justice and humanity, in my opinion, loudly call upon them to emancipate those unhappy people, to contend for our own liberty, and to deny that blessing to others involves an inconsistency not to be excused. They saw how evil it was to the South at the time. And here's John Adams. Every measure of providence, therefore, ought to be assumed for the eventual total extirpation of slavery from the United States. I have, throughout my whole life, held the practice of slavery in abhorrence. It was a bad idea. It was a bad thing. It held the South back. The verse that Abraham Lincoln used to free the slaves, and it is Psalm 128, verse 2, and you will enjoy the fruit of your labor, how joyful and prosperous you will be. So everyone deserves to have the fruit of their labor. The controllers want to take, the slave owners want to take your fruit because they think they know better to do with it, but it takes away their joy and takes away their prosperity of everyone involved. And Tocqueville said that the work ethic of the South just wasn't there. The slaves did the minimum, and the slave owners never learned how to have a work ethic. And unfortunately, it just didn't work out well for them. 9 facts about slavery they don't want you to know. I got this from the web. The first legal slave owner in America's history was a tobacco farmer named Anthony Johnson. North Carolina's largest slaveholder in 1860 was a black plantation owner named William Ellison. American Indians owned thousands of black slaves. In 1830, there were 775 free black slaves who owned 12,740 black slaves. Many black slaves were allowed to hold jobs, own businesses, and own real estate. Brutal black-on-black slavery was common in Africa for thousands of years. The Muslims castrated the slaves, and that's the way they controlled them. Most slaves brought to America from Africa were purchased from black slave owners, and actually it was Muslim slave owners in Africa. Slavery was common for thousands of years, and white people ended legal chattel slavery. It was Christian, Bible believing white people, and also there were black people that were involved too. But to say white people are responsible for slavery when they're the ones who did more to end it than anyone else is totally wrong. South Carolina and Louisiana had more black slave owners than they had white slave owners. Walter Williams says, prior to capitalism, the way people amassed great wealth was by looting, plundering, and enslaving their fellow man. Capitalism made it possible to become wealthy by serving your fellow man. That's what we're to do as Christians, serve our fellow man. And it controls the depravity of man. If they're greedy, they have to serve their fellow man. And capitalism is based on basically the teaching of John Calvin in the Reformed doctrine. Thomas Sowell, blacks were not enslaved because they were black, but because they were available. Slavery had existed in the world for thousands of years. Whites enslaved other whites in Europe for centuries before the first black was brought to the Western Hemisphere. Asians enslaved Europeans. Asians enslaved other Asians. Africans enslaved other Africans. Indeed, even today in North Africa, blacks continue to enslave blacks. And that's what's really going on in the world. It's not a new idea. When they got with the biblical worldview, then society is advanced, and they got universities and schools, and they got science started because they got with God and they were blessed following Route 66. And this is an example, probably what was going on basically around the world, but from the book Conquering the Dark Continent, which documents what Dr. Stanley Livingstone found in Africa when he arrived there in 1840. He went on to learn about the culture and his attempt to end the slave trade. And he explained how people have changed, achieved wealth, what was considered riches in early Africa. First, they would go out and murder your neighbor. Not love your neighbor, you murder your neighbor. Take his wife and children, sell your neighbor's male children to the Muslim slave traders. He's documenting what he saw going on. Take your neighbor's daughters as wives. Keep all the wives and daughters of the people you murdered pregnant. Sell your children to the Muslim slave traders. Measure your wealth in goats and cattle. Not a good system. That's probably the reason you think they might have been held back and not flourished. Stephen Jay Gould, leading evolutionist and Marxist, as well as staunch anti-racist, yet he admitted biological arguments for racism have been common before 1850, but they increased by order of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. The litany is familiar, cold, dispassionate, objective. Modern science shows us that the races can be ranked on a scale of superiority. If this offends Christian morality or a sentimental belief in human unity, so be it. He's saying it goes against the Christian idea of unity. It goes against the Christian idea of morality. He's saying tough luck. Science must be free to proclaim unpleasant truths. Well, they're proclaiming lies, and they're saying satanic lies, evolution. Here is an anthropologist, Indian Lativa Vetili. He said his Darwin's theory of the survival of the fittest was warmly welcomed by the social scientists of the day, and they believed mankind had achieved various levels of evolution culminating in the white man's civilization. By the second half of the 19th century, racism was accepted as a fact in the vast majority of Western scientists. Well, they're moving away from that, and now we got to try to move the world back to the biblical worldview. Darwin's book on the origin of species by means of natural selection. He doesn't talk about the origin of species, actually, and the subtitle is "Or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life." He only talks about the animal races, and he says he'll talk about the human races later, and he did that in his book, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. And here's a quote from his book. As some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. That was his vision for the future. He was a punk, and he didn't do much, but his bulldogs like Huxley spread his ideas around the world, and it changed the world to racist society, and multiplied it by a magnitude of a million times, basically. He talking about Darwin, Peter Bowler. That is, by the time he writes The Descent of Man in 1871, it's pretty clear that he, by that time, shared the growing suspicion or conviction of many Europeans that non-white races simply do not have the capacity to be elevated properly into civilized human beings, that they are mentally and morally at a more limited level. In a sense, they are stuck at an early stage of biological evolution of the human species. Now they're stuck in a bad stage of culture and rejection of God, and it's nothing to do with biology. Some bad things happened. Here's a story by David Mongo. Spent 18 months documenting the atrocities in the name of science, and he wrote a documentary called Darwin's Body Snatchers, and Black Slain for Science, White Superior Theory. Some ideas from that the Australian Aborigines might be the missing link, and many were killed to put on display in science museums around the world. The highlighted text reads, it also appears Aborigines were murdered to obtain specimens for science, were killed for display. A deathbed memoir written by Wills, a gold rush immigrant who became the mayor of Bowen in Queensland, contained the confession about killing of an Aborigine who was later used for display. And one of close friends of Darwin said, the black people of Australia, exactly the same race as the African Negro, cannot take in the gospel. All attempts to bring them to a knowledge of the true God have yet utterly failed. Poor brutes in human shape, they must perish off the face of the earth like brute beasts. Just this idea. They attack people from Europe after they got this idea. They attacked people in Africa, paid a horrible toll, and we see this. Maybe I didn't hear about this, and so that's why I brought it up there. But just countries in Africa were wiped out in trying to bring about advancement in evolution. The idea of the term races, labeling people as races, was made up word by Leon Trotsky in 1927. The word was used to browbeat all dissenters of the communist ideology. It's still used in the day in the West to shut down all nonconformists. They basically had, they took on some people of race and called all the opposition to communism racist. And it was a different ideology, but they just used it to shut down people. And there may have been some races involved, but actually Karl Marx was a huge racist. And it's still used in that way today. And we have to fight against this idea of inferior races, that people groups is what they are, and that they evolved from monkeys. Lenin won in Russia by using identity politics, pitting one group against another, inciting violence, creating anarchy. Private property and businesses were dissolved along with freedom of speech. That's what you do, divide the kingdom to conquer it, divide and conquer. Hitler, using evolutionary theory to justify racial supremacy. If nature does not wish that the weaker individual should mate with the stronger, she wishes even less that a superior race should intermingle with an inferior one, because in such case, all her efforts throughout the hundreds of thousands of years to establish an evolutionary higher stage of being may thus be rendered futile. They're the ones who don't believe in mixed marriages, and I think it's wrong to marry your cousin and marry a close relative, and you have better genetic results if you marry somebody not so close relative. And the key is not marrying an unbeliever. Here's Hitler's hit list from Hitler Movement, page 107. The Nordics were pure Aryan, close to it, Germanic, brown, blue-eyed and brown hair, predominantly Aryan, Mediterranean, slightly Aryan, Slavic, close to half Aryan, half ape, Oriental, slightly ape predominance, Black Americans, predominantly apes, Jewish, close to pure apes. Interesting that these evil people love, they hate the God's people. They love to hate the Jews. And what they do, they try to put gold stars on you so you got to identify them, and they can point them out and say, oh, there they are. And unfortunately, people of color are stuck with that and have some complications, and they shouldn't. And but that's when somebody is anti-Semitic, that's just totally in rebellion against God. Margaret Sanger founded Planned Parenthood on October 16, 1960, in order to eliminate what she thought were inferior races like Orientals, Jews, and blacks. She referred to them as human weeds. She was an alcoholic and died of alcohol poisoning. I believe the white people are superior to other races. I believe Hitler's eugenics ideology, and I support the Ku Klux Klan. I push for the forced sterilization of those less fortunate than me. I oppose charity, welfare programs for the poor, because I believe they were better off dead. I usher in a world where abortion has enabled my idea that some lives matter less. Interesting. They're accusing us or the police of saying that some lives matter less, but they don't tear down statutes of Margaret Sanger. And the Ku Klux Klan, they might have some good ideas. They claim to be a Christian organization, but they're about as Christian as the slave owners in the South, I'm afraid. Booker T. Washington, educator, reformist, and most influential black leader of his time, preached a philosophy of self-help, racial solidarity, and accommodation. He urged blacks to accept discrimination for the time being and concentrate on elevating themselves through hard work and material prosperity. He's saying by fixing our culture and us showing them how great they are, they're going to forget about our skin color. It's a fact right now, but what we do is work hard and change things in our culture and show them. And that's what happened in the NBA and the other professional sports. The NBA, they thought blacks could maybe play defense and could rebound. They couldn't score and couldn't handle the ball. Well, they worked hard and they got a shot, and so they started working really hard when they had an opportunity. They didn't get any special advantage. Now they dominate the league. It wasn't anything inferior about them. It's just that they took hard work and went for a goal, and they achieved it. Washington argues that this is Booker T., that African Americans must concentrate on educating themselves, learning useful trades, and investing in their own businesses. Hard work, economic progress, and merit, he believed, would prove to whites the value of blacks to American economy. Of all forms of slavery, there is none that is so harmful and degrading as that form of slavery which tempts one human being to hate another by reason of his race or color. One man cannot hold another man down in the ditch without remaining down in the ditch with him. This idea of skin color is bad, he said, basically. Here's a fellow, Manning Rudolph Johnson. He was an African-American leader, and he became part of the Communist party in the USA. He ran for Congress, and he saw that there was a problem with the communists, and they were inviting all the black folks in, and he saw that it went against his religion, and he was against the idea of the Soviet Negro Republic in the black belt of USA. They're trying to divide us, and he became a spy and an informant for the government, and the government learned about it, and he wrote this book eventually, Color, Communism, and Common Sense. A few days after the book was published, he ended up dead at the hands of the Communist Party. Booker T. Washington, another quote for him, "There is a class of colored people who make a business of keeping the troubles, the wrongs, the hardship of the Negro race before the public. Having learned that they are able to make a living out of their troubles, they have grown into the settled habit of advertising their wrongs, partly because they want sympathy, partly because it pays. Some of these people do not want the Negro to lose their grievances because they would lose their jobs. They aren't earning a living, they aren't helping anybody, they're just basically keeping people down, but they don't realize that they're keeping themselves down in the process." Thomas Soros says, racism is not dead, but it is kept on life support, kept alive by politicians, race hustlers, and people who get a sense of superiority by denouncing others as racist. They get a sense of superiority by saying those who disagree with them are racist, and they're not looking at others as being better than themselves. It's another way of feeding their degeneracy. Even Charles Barkley says, "We as black people, we are never going to succeed, not because of you white people, but because others of the black race. It's a dirty, dark secret. You know, when they are young black kids doing well in school, the loser kids will tell them, 'Oh, you're acting white.' For some reason, we are brainwashed to think if you're not a thug or an idiot, you're not being black enough. They're trying to control them. We're trying to free people and trying to get them to see the light and come together and have strong marriages and have strong families." Waddy Boakman, "We are not seeing terrible things in our culture because we vote the wrong way. We are seeing terrible things in our culture because men love darkness rather than light." George Soros, he's the source behind a lot of these Antifa movements and BLM, along with other elitists like the Ford Motor Company, the Taco Bell guy. Go check it out. All these big groups are funding them. And he says, interview in 2014, "I'm going to bring down the United States by funding black hate groups. We'll put them into a mental trap and make them blame white people. The black community is the easiest to manipulate. What a shame. We got to get them out of their mental traps. We got to free them. And the truth is what's going to free them. And we have the truth. And Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life." Martin Luther King, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of skin, but the content of their character." I guess that's why the communist movement had him shot too. In the 1960s, 40% of blacks owned their own business. 87% of black families were two-parented. Less than 7% today own blacks-owned businesses. Only 25% of black families are two-parented. What changed? What happened? They went back with the slave owner idea. We'll give you a place to live, and we'll give you food, and we'll take care of you, and all you got to do is support us. Be dependent on us. The Democrats decided that entitlements work much more efficiently at keeping black Americans in their place than the previous tools of ropes, torches, fire hoses, and building crosses ever did. Crime, illegitimacy, dropout, and poverty rates among Black Americans began significantly skyrocketing from that year forward. So F.A. Hayek said there is a difference in the world between treating people equally and attempting to make them equal. The first in the community is the condition of a free society. The second means, as de Tocqueville describes it, a new form of servitude. So when they're trying to equalize the results, it's a form of servitude. They aren't helping anybody. They're hurting everybody, including themselves. The importance of two parents, the importance of marriage, and this is something we need to preach to the world because they just don't get it. Educational psychologist Carol Gilligan tells us that fathers stress justice, fairness, and duty based on rules, while mothers stress sympathy, care, and help based on relationship. Fathers tend to observe and enforce rules systematically and sternly, teaching the children the consequences of right and wrong. Mothers tend towards grace and sympathy, providing a sense of hopefulness. Again, either of these disciplinary approaches by themselves is not good, but together they create a healthy, proper balance. That's the way God wants it, and that's the way God designed it. That's where to preach to the world. And, well, what about, can't gay couples have it? No, they don't have the diversity to come together. We have the diversity in marriage, like the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and that works in us, that we come out right. In the same way, there's got to be parents, two parents involved in the bringing up of children, and in the cases of orphaned, where the father dies and problems happen, we have to step in, maybe adopt the children, or step in and help them out in any way we can, if we're uncles or grandparents or involved in any way. If that is God's best for those children, for them to have two parents, opposite sex. Facts about fatherlessness. They represent 63% of teen suicides, 70% of juveniles in state institutions, 71% of high school dropouts, 75% of children in chemical abuse centers, 80% of rapists, 85% of youth in prison, 90% of homeless and runaway children. And there's a lot more to that. That's just some basic facts. When I was in the juvenile division, I found that habitual juveniles that have been arrested 3 or more times, I checked, over 95% came from a fatherless home. And that's amazing that they get that. And when a suspect gets arrested, you got to understand, they probably did another 1,000 crimes for every one time they get arrested. So they're out there doing a whole lot of crimes. A quote from David Bloomfield: "The U.S. is becoming an increasingly fatherless society. A generation ago, an American child could reasonably expect to grow up with his or her father. Today in America, a child can reasonably expect not to. Fatherlessness is now approaching a rough parity with fatherhood as a defining feature of the American childhood." It's a big problem. Divorce, and it's not just exclusively to the people with dark skin. It's getting more and more to the lighter skin, other people groups, and it's a bad thing that we have to fight against if we want God's best for those children. Submission to government. This is a big problem. This is what fathers do, teach them to be submitted to the law. And this is a big problem going on today, where they're attacking the police. And I want to talk a little bit about police. And Romans 13:1-6 says, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, Whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from the fear of the ones in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for the ruler do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servant, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to authorities, and not only because of possible punishment, but as a matter of consciousness. That's a fundamental truth that we need to teach our children. And what are we teaching our children today? We got schools that are teaching children, be careful because police are murdering children every day walking home from school. They're teaching children that the police are the enemy. Basically, they're teaching that God is the enemy, is what they're doing. The problem with, it talks about the sword. I'll tell you, with almost all, 98% of police shootings, it involves somebody running from the police or not doing what the police, fighting with the police, and other things. If they would all cooperate and submit to what the officer says, 98% of the police shootings would not happen. I read an article recently, it was very sad. A Fort Worth doctor, he said, I was taught by my mother and father to respect authority, to respect the police. But they were wrong. I should never have been learned that. Well, look what happened to him. He respected authority. He didn't end up a thug. He didn't end up on drugs and in prison. He ended up a medical doctor, and he's talking bad about it. Everybody's talking bad about it. It's just something that we have to fight against as followers of Christ. A few stats here. Let's see, whites killing blacks, 2%. Black police killing whites, 3%. Whites killing whites, 16%. Blacks killing whites, 81%. Police killing blacks, 1%. Blacks killing blacks, 97%. Yes, American does have a major problem, but it's not with what the media tells you it is. Stats don't lie. The problem is people coming from fatherless families. It's rare for the police to kill anyone. A black man is more likely to be killed by lightning than by a police officer. In 2019, police shot and killed 1,003 people in the U.S., according to the Washington Post Fatal Force database. Of those, 250 were black and 405 white. Police shot and killed 55 unarmed suspects, including 25 whites and 14 blacks. And they were all doing something bad. In 2015, about 53.5 million people had at least one contact with the police. 95% of those contacts involved traffic stops, according to the Bureau of Statistics. According to BJS special report, 91% of whites and 85% blacks contacted by police during traffic stops said police behave properly. Of citizens contacted during street stops, 81 of the police acted properly. Only 2% of the citizens contacted by police experienced force or the threat of force. So it's not a big group. We don't have people with targets on their backs. The police officers, I put them into 4 categories. You have basically some that are there for a paycheck, that's lazy. I think all occupations are probably like that. You have the patriots that are doing it to serve and protect the people. You have the Christians that are doing it to serve the Lord and serve and protect the people. But you also have the narcissists, the gnarly people. And when unfortunately, they try to get rid of these types, and they don't always do it, and it's not always an easy thing to do it. They try to eliminate it before they come on by having a tough screening system. And when I saw that fellow getting his neck wrung up there in Minnesota, I thought, man, that's one of the gnarly ones. So what do? They say all cops are like that. What? He's a very small percentage of the cops, and to condemn all the cops, just is totally goes against divine thinking. Basically, it's totally evil. You're being treated poor by police. Have you tried not breaking the law and see if that helps? So that's the key. Let's not go ahead and break the law. Black Lives Matter. I want to talk a little bit about it, and I think the idea, a lot of people accept it because they said, some people, like they say, cops don't think Black Lives Matter. Well, cops do think. They would take a bullet to prevent a black civilian from getting killed. And they think all lives matter, but they think because they killed some and they think that it's unjust, and it's portrayed that way by the press and a lot of different ones, that they're saying black lives don't matter, but they're saying basically that Black Lives Matter too. They're trying to say it should be included, and that's what most believe. But it's run by a Marxist group. They're being trained by Marxists, and they're trying to divide. Tonight is the 4-year anniversary where the police were protecting a BLM movement. They came together, a protest, and one of the members went and got a gun and executed 5 cops on this night. I'm sure you remember it, 5 years ago. And they desecrated that memorial during the recent riots. And it was a bad thing. It was a horrible thing. It was an evil thing. Black Lives Matters member went down to Louisiana and killed 2 cops a few days later. And it's if you read their website, they're anti-family, they're anti-fatherhood. This is what their fundamental beliefs are. They are anti-police, they are anti-prisons, and they are Marxist socialists. Just, they are a bad group, and a lot of people are being forced to contribute to them. A lot of corporations say, oh, this is a good group, we're going to show that we care by giving to this group, and they're trying to divide us. And here's a quote from one of them in a newspaper. Black Lives Matter Toronto leader says white are subhuman and should be wiped out. Actually, this comes from Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam movement, which was part of the Black Lives movement. And they believe that whites are the son of Lucifer, sons of Lucifer, the offspring of Lucifer. And they justify this idea of this superior, we're superior, you're inferior. As reported by The Sun, the comments were made in late 2005. She wrote that whiteness is not humanness and white skin is subhuman. White people are recessive genetic defects. This is factual. The post added that she promoted the extinction of the white race. White people need white supremacy as a mechanism to protect their survival as a people, because they all can do is produce themselves. Black people, simply through their dominant genes, can literally wipe out the white race if we have the power to. So just this whole idea of we're genetically better, this is something we have to fight against. We have the science, we have the Bible, we have the truth. And the solution is coming together. And 2 Chronicles 7:14, if my people will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and forgive their sin and heal their land. He wants us to humble ourselves and come together and seek him as a group. And that's what we need to do as a country. We're only going to come together if we get rid of this evolution idea, we get rid of this genetic idea, we get rid of this racist idea that we're all one and we're to seek God's best. And I did this in high school. There was a black friend of mine. There weren't many blacks in the school, and he was backup running back in our football team. And he only went played towards the end of the game. He never really got a chance to start because the starting running back, tailback, was an all-stater, and he just wasn't that good. And his problem was he was 5'6" and 120 pounds. He had good speed, but he just didn't. He wasn't able to pass up the number one running back. And so what happened during the junk time at the end of the game, when the game was out of reach, I had told all the linemen, let's really, really block for Mike when he gets in. I told the cheerleaders, get the fans excited when he gets in. So it was crazy. The fans went crazy. He got in. We got fired up. We blocked the heck, and we made holes big enough you could drive a Mack truck through. He averaged at least 15 yards per carry. Well, I think this is what we got to do. We got to cheer them on. We got to help them to be the best they can be. We got to block for them, but we got to do our job in the process. And we don't need to be victims, and we don't need them to think like victims. And we need to get them to come to Christ.